All right, good afternoon and welcome to the 5th lecture of the 2025 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 27th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. And my name is John Carlton. I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us and to my co-organizer, Diane Dehoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. First, I want to announce the first ever collaboration of Don and Bill Coffey, who will be doing a pop-up lecture on October 30th at 6 p.m. on the life and art of Paul Sawyer. So if you didn't know, September is Archaeology Month in Kentucky and several other states, and I hope you were able to participate in some of the activities put on this month by groups like the Kentucky Heritage Council, Capital City Museum, and the City of Frankfort's Planning Department and Architectural Review Board. Earlier this month, they hosted Archaeology in Action for kids to learn about the art and process of archaeology, and just this morning, a volunteer dig for adults. And I want to thank them for putting on those events to teach our community about the important discipline of archaeology. Archaeology is an essential discipline because it uncovers the stories of people who came before us, preserving evidence of their lives, struggles, and achievements that written records alone can't capture. By carefully studying artifacts, sites, and landscapes, archaeologists help us understand how cultures evolved, how communities adapted to challenges, and how our shared history connects us today. The work of scientific, public and private scientific, academic, and government institutions like the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, Kentucky Heritage Council, and Kentucky Office of State Archaeology not only protect fragile traces of the past from being lost forever, but they also deepen our appreciation of the diverse roots that shape our present and future. Today's lecturer is one part of an esteemed duo who are among the most highly regarded archaeologists in the state and region. About this time last year, his wife, Dr. Gwen Henderson, Education Director for the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, graced us with a lecture on the lives and cultures of the first peoples and indigenous populations that called Kentucky home for over 11,000 years, with a first ever special focus on Franklin County. And we're just as excited to have her husband here, who was the principal investigator on the project he'll be discussing today. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out and sharing this beautiful day with us here at the library. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney, and I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of everyone here, we just want to thank you for coming out and being with us today. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. David Pollack. He received his BA in Anthropology from Beloit College in 1977, his MA in Anthropology from the University of Kentucky in 1982, and his Ph.D. in Anthropology from the University of Kentucky in 1998. He worked for the Kentucky Heritage Council from 1982 until 2008 as a staff archaeologist and the Site Protection Program Manager. Since 1996, he has been the director of the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, a program of Western Kentucky University's Department of Society, Culture, Crime, and Justice Studies. He has over 40 years of experience in Kentucky archaeology and has conducted archaeological research at sites throughout the Commonwealth. He has published extensively on Kentucky archaeology with an emphasis on indigenous village farmers. Please help me to welcome today Dr. David Pollack.
All right, well, thanks for that kind introduction. And so I will not be talking about village farmers today, but I will be talking about the old Frankfort Cemetery. And those of you that already picked up the booklet, do not fact check me as I go. But, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the discovery of the cemetery, how we approached it, what we did, and then highlight some of the things we learned about the people that live there. And a lot of those were surprises to us. Others were things that we expected to see. So the area we're going to be talking about is the area where the transportation building now stands. And when they started construction of the cemetery, the building, they discovered human remains, and like they stopped. And they called the Heritage Council, called me up and said, well, Dave, I think we got burials. So I came out to check on the burials to see if in fact that is what they had. Now, I will admit that we were rather surprised to see burials there, because we had actually done background research on this area. The state, we had looked at the Craw neighborhood and looked at the areas, but we had not picked up any evidence reference to the cemetery. But here's again, the focus is there a pointer on this? Right. But you guys can see at the top of the page, that's where the building now stands. So it covered much of the Craw area, and again, other buildings. So this is what it looked like in 1950. The ice house is there, the poorhouse is there. I'll be coming back to those spots. The Lusher Brewery was there. And so again, it was all built up, so there was no green space there. There was no evidence of anything being there. And so we organized a bunch of people to come out to do the work here. And I initially told them, I said, guys, I think there'll be 30 burials out here. And they're like, okay. So we started doing this work. We had a backhoe coming through, clearing soil for us, and we'd identify the graves. And so there were days they would come out and they'd say, Dave, in the morning, they'd say, how many burials you have? And I'd say 15. And then it would come at the end of the day, they say, how many burials you have? And I'd say 30, which was somewhat depressing for the guys that were in charge of this and wanted to move on. So all in all, we excavated about 242 graves and burials. And so here we are beginning to carefully expose it. I'm just going to go through the process here. So again, finally carefully identifying the grave. Again, exposing all of the bones, identifying all the artifacts that are with the burial. So again, we would photograph each burial individually, then map it, and then carefully remove the remains, keeping each bone separate so the bones would break up. So you'd want to keep like your left arm bones together, your left leg bones together, so when you got back to the lab, you could put it back together and you could collect information on it. And so again, once we brought the remains back to the lab, we carefully washed everything off, again, keeping track of what was together, because again, in archaeology, everything is provenience. So we don't want to mix things. We want to keep everything separate so we can see what was buried with the person and also maintain those remains so when the individuals were buried, all those remains are together. And of course, collecting a lot of information. And again, we'll come back to this kind of information that we collected when we talk about what was the race and ethnicity of the people here, what's their age, what kind of health patterns, things, how did they live, and what may be some of the causes of death. So even though we did not pick up on our initial work the fact that there was a cemetery here. Once we went back into the records and started actually looking, we did find some basic references to the cemetery. And so Gilson, who was a state archaeologist in the early 90s, he makes reference to Fort Hill Bluff, the Potter's Field, and And this is where I got to cheat a little bit because I got to go back into the report and actually see what we wrote about some of this. So there, when they opened up the big Frankfort Cemetery on top of the hill, they moved a lot of graves. So, and mostly graves of people that of note or of wealth. So there is reference to the removal of General John Caldwell, who died in 1804. So there's that documentation that his grave was removed. And there is this article from the 1860s of Samuel Hickcraft, who comes back to the region, and he talks about, and he talks about that when he comes back, that the cemetery is not as neat, it's more overgrown, there's things that are not, these things I can't see. And so there's that, we found that rare. And then there's also this map, this painting that a British prisoner made, drew it, and he shows shows the cemetery here and these little plots right here of other individuals. So as we went back to this, we did see, okay, there were references, and we felt bad because probably we should have picked up on these in our research, but to be honest, we missed it in part because we were focusing more on the buildings that were there and the Craw neighborhood, and we thought, well, everything over here has already been disturbed by the Lustre Distillery, and so we just did not pick up on that. So here basically, when we went through, this is a map showing you the 242 burials, and I'll refer to the upper area and the lower area. And the upper area is up closer to where the poorhouse is, up on a higher ground, better drain. The lower area is down lower as you get into more marshy areas. And so again, that's going to speak to who is buried where and what their status is. And you also see that there is the Capital City Brewery Ice House there. And if you look closely, you will see where when they built that, they disturbed burials. So they knew the cemetery was there, and they knew they were disturbing graves, and which is not uncommon as once graves get lost. When cemeteries get lost to history, oftentimes people build on top of them, or as I found with a lot of developers sometimes, if they don't know the people that are buried there, then well, it's not really a burial, it's not really a cemetery. So again, here you can see the location of those two areas, the upper area and the lower area that I'm talking about. And so as we went through here, we determined everybody was buried in a coffin. So, and even though I'm going to be talking about past and over areas more than one time, no burial intersected another burial. So we don't have evidence of people being, one burial intruding another, disturbing. Each is individually laid out in a coffin. On your left, there is a part of a brass handle, and on the left you can see some of the coffin wood still preserved. Most of the coffin wood was hickory or red cedar. And everybody had a coffin, and we could tell everybody had a coffin by the distribution of the nails that were left. So the wood might not be there, but you could plot the distribution of the nails. And so again, here are some examples of the coffin hardware. There is, so again, some of the brass handles, machine cut nails. Then there's a little, what are those called? Not, uh-oh. That's where I got to cheat again. What are those things called again? You guys should know that. What's that? Yeah, a little text, basically to hold cloth in place. And so they preserve a little bit of the wood too because they're copper. And then we have one metal coffin. And that's what you're seeing there is a little bit of the wood attached to the metal coffin. And so again, so here's some of the examples of us photographing the burial. And I put this in there because, and I've sort of gotten interested on this on cemeteries, is where people are placing their hands. Where do they place the hands, and what kind of patterning it? Here, basically about a third of the burials have their arms across like this, and over those 2/3 are females. And then you'll see about 3/4 of the burials have their legs, their hands over the pelvic area, and of those, 3/4 are men. And so that's what you're seeing on your left-hand side. And then the right-hand side, most other people, they're just placing the arms basically at their sides. And so we found straight pins with 112 individuals. Most were children or infants, and they were probably wrapped in a shroud. And you can see up at, I wish I had a pointer on this thing. Yeah, we go. See this, that little swirl? So those pins are a little earlier than the later pins, which are single. So this is more like a dual that's attached. This is where a single machine made. So that you can date, this is part of what we're using to help date the burials, which ones are earlier, which ones are later. And of course, there's a variety of buttons that we're finding, wood buttons. And these are, oops, go back to my pointer there. These are, God damn, I'm drawing blanks on these things. These are calico covered glass butt. What's the processor? Me and names anymore. Yeah, those. See, that's why I got. That's why I brought Gwen here to get. So those are, again, and those are, you can date those also. And then you have some shell buttons and some brass buttons. And again, so we plot out the distribution of the buttons, see where they're located. So you can see here, this is a male with a bunch of buttons on, so these probably pants. And so again, by plotting these things, we're able to determine something about the clothing. Then again, there were a few burials that had coins over their eyes. These are in the wrong one there. These are 1848 and 1850 dimes that were placed over the eyes of one woman. So again, it gives you some idea of the dating. Nobody knows really, I don't think anybody really knows why people did that. There's a lot of speculation, but nobody really knows why. And again, it's just on a few individuals. And there were a few women that had necklaces. And again, you can see it, right, that is this necklace here. And there were rings with 13 individuals. And so one of them, is this nice copper diamond-shaped ring here. And then there's a couple of brass rings here. And you can see the designs on one of them. There was one person that had their glasses with them. And so again, so I was talking about, in terms of dating the burials and when the interments are, so you can see a lot of things. So we have things like hexagonal coffins predate 1840s, swirled head pins, which I showed you before, which predate 1835, and then things like prosser buttons, 1840s, buckles. So again, these things, we find that with a person, we're assuming, again, that tells us something about the age. And so we were able to divide up the cemetery into an early and later stages. And again, this is just highlighting some of those earlier artifacts and highlighting the later. So this is, again, how we could sort through. And so again, this just gives you back a reference point here, earlier and later. Okay. And here now, so we've gone through, we've analyzed the burials, and we're going to start getting to some of our results. And so you'll see here, this is the upper, so this is early. So this is the pre-1840, this is after 1840. Pre, post. So, and the blue dots are African American burials, the red are European American burials. And so I don't know if you'll notice, so this upper area, it's both African American and Euro American early on, both areas, same later on. So again, you're not seeing any segregation here based on ethnicity. So there is some segregation, and I'll talk about it as I go through it, not based on where you're located and this, maybe how fancy your coffin is, the kind of things you're buried with. But that, again, is not based on race. It is based on where you're located, and so, which is going to lead us towards who we think is buried in this cemetery. So I put this in just to contrast you. These are two other cemeteries that we've looked at. And one is out at the horse park. And again, it was another situation where, again, we did not do any advance on this one. They went out and they started construction and they hit a cemetery, and it was during the equestrian games. And so again, they were in a big hurry. Unlike the Frankfort Cemetery, which was in decent weather, this was in the winter time. So we were out there in December, and it was a cold December. So we were out there some days it was 20 degrees out. But, and then the Terrell Cemetery is a small rural cemetery in Madison County. But what you'll see here is, so you can see again in this cemetery, these are the European Americans. They're all oriented in the same direction, typical east-west. These are the African American burial. You'll see that there is segregation here. So there is a purposeful segregation, and you can see again, there is something with the African Americans is that they're oriented their graves in a different direction. And so we think that is a way for that, then in some way they are saying this is who we are different. It's one way of them showing that kind of resistance. And you can see now this one, these three here up on the trail, we're assuming that they're African American. These ones we actually had, the bone preservation was good enough that we could, through our analysis, determine that. At this cemetery, it wasn't a Terrell, but we're thinking because of that orientation, we're suggesting that's what it is. So I have to confess that when I was looking at this thing yesterday, I actually had it reversed. I had these burials lined up in the same direction as those guys, and I was like, what's going on? And I was realized, man, that's a mistake in that report I have to go back and correct. But again, it speaks to, again, what I was saying before about how the Frankfort Cemetery is laid out and how people were selecting where to place people. And so again, this gives you some other breakdown of the cemetery. And again, you can see, again, through time, again, this is the upper lay, so you can see a little bit more mixing of a little more European evening out here, and you see in the lower it sort of maintains the same basic thing. And while this is important, it does show a lot of these are the ones that had the more fancier coffins, had the more fancier graves. So again, early on, and this is leading us again, and to think that there are a lot of freed African Americans here. So it's, we're beginning to think, okay, get into it more going, but it's basically this cemetery composition is European, lower to middle class European Americans, the enslaved, as well as freed African Americans. And again, this is getting into some of now, these graves are, a lot of these graves are lined with stone, and a lot of the graves also have stone caps on top of them. So again, you can see some of the lining, and you can see here the stone cap. And I'll show you, so as somebody focuses on Native American stuff, when I first saw this, we have what we call stone box graves in Native American sites, and they look just like this. And I'm like, what is going on? But no, these are clearly European American and African American. And you can see here they're reusing an old headstone. Again, a couple more examples. And again, what these limestone slabs do too, and which benefits us as archaeologists, is they help preserve the bones. So these bones are in a lot better state of preservation than they would be without that limestone. If they were just in to the side of the slope up there, the bones would not be in as good a shape as they are. And you can see this one up the top, it has a brick base, then the stones. And again, most of these ones you're seeing here had stones on top. We've just removed them as we went down. And in fact, some of the graves had air pockets. The stones were so well there that then there was a pocket of air. And that's why you can have a grave like this child, that the skull is still as good a shape as it is. And so again, as we went through the population, you can see, so again, we identified 242 individuals, a large number of infants and children. Again, as I'll show you guys a little later, that's not out of whack, or that's not extraordinary. You had high infant mortality rates at that time, so it's not surprising that you see that. And this kind of gives you the breakdown in terms of ethnicity, the height, weight. So yeah, so here's our demographics on the old Frankfort Cemetery, taking everybody, and here's the demographics from the Franklin County. And so you'll notice here that there's actually a higher frequency percentage of very young dying, but that also could be that they've got better records in terms of but if you see, like here in this age group, it's almost exactly the same. This age group is almost exactly the same. And there's even slightly higher older people. So again, it's really kind of consistent with what you would see in the general population. And so by studying the bones, we can learn more about these people's health. And in addition to turning age, we can look at their health. And so I think, can you guys all see these lines? So these are what we call enamel hypoplasias, and they're growth lines on your teeth that occur from stress. And it's usually dietary stress, something's happening, and it says there, between 2 to 4 years old. So it's recording that stress, and we see that on a lot of the burials in here. But you're going to see that on a lot of burials from that time period in general. So again, it's not special to this population, and it's not surprising. And so one of the things we did here, we had the opportunity to do what we call stable isotope analysis, and this tells you basically things about diet, and in particular C4 plants like corn. So this tells you are people eating a lot of corn, are they drinking a lot of bourbon, or are they doing that kind of stuff. That's going to influence and show up in your bones. And so you can see here, we compared, we got some other information on Eastern State Hospital, which is another large burial population that we looked at for the state about the same time. Vardaman is a rural cemetery, and the horse park. And so when you look at these numbers, these are negative numbers, so as you go up, so like 11.5 is high. You're getting a lot of corn-based products. If you have a negative 22, you're not. So like at Old Frankfort Cemetery, if you see somebody with a 20.5, they're probably new to the area. They probably moved here, and they died somewhat recently after some shorter period of time after they did, because there's not enough, it hasn't been absorbed into the bones. But then you have people that are eating an awful lot of corn. If you see a 9.2, that person is probably 60 to 80% of their diet is corn-based products. And again, that includes bourbon, but it's basically anything, and these are some kind of numbers. We see these on Native American populations when they turn to corn, when they start becoming full-time agriculturalists, they have similar numbers. And I'm really not sure why the Eastern State Hospital population, is overall eating much less corn-based products. And the only thing I can hypothesize is that institutionally they're feeding them something different, or there's just a lot of people that are coming there that weren't born and raised in this area. So one of the other fun things we did, and again as a way to try to bring these people back to life, we took all these forensic measurements here. And so you can see, and so this then allowed us, we took those measurements, then we went and made plastic casts. So we had those generated, and then we had a forensic artist with us. And so she basically took those measurements and used those measurements to create this portrait with this person and bring this person back to life. And yeah, so this was a young girl that she died around 1835. Coffin was lined with tacks, and she had been placed in a stone vault. So this is an African American female of West African descent, and we could determine that because we did DNA on some of these individuals. And so by determining the DNA, we were able to determine she's West Africa, most likely. And what I found interesting, the DNA pretty much corroborate what our physical anthropologist was able to assess without the DNA. But what the DNA allows you to do that we couldn't do with it is you can do the children. So, because usually you can't determine children based on the measurements we're taking, but through the DNA we could. And so this was a very large black man, again of African American descent based on the DNA. He had stress lines on his teeth, which indicated periods of nutritional stress at ages 2, 3, and 4. As with others in the cemetery, he had arthritis on his back as a result of heavy lifting. So this individual we determined, we think had cerebral palsy or had some sort of an accident later in life that created, you know, this disjunct with the jaw. So, but again, and yeah. And so, you know, when you, in pulling all this together and looking at all these things, you start, you know, what did we learn? What did we come away with? And again, so one of the things was, again, it's an early to mid-19th century neighborhood cemetery. And people are being placed in there, the graves are being marked, they're being maintained. And again, it's freed and enslaved African Americans, as well as European Americans were interred in the cemetery. And again, as I showed earlier, there's no indication of segregation based on ethnicity. There is segregation, again, in terms of who's in the higher ground and who's in the lower ground, and what are you buried with. So again, upper ground, you're going to have more of the coffin hardware that I showed before, more jewelry, more of the. You're down the low ground, you're still going to be buried in a coffin, but you're not going to have as a fancy a coffin, you're not going to have the cloth lining. Again, again, everybody was hardworking. We see a lot of in their muscle, their attachments, the bulking, because, you know, as anybody does construction, you know, you get big muscles, and that's going to show up on your bones, and it's going to show up in your robusticity. And again, we think some of the people, based on the absence of corn in their diet, were what may have been immigrants, new to, at least immigrants to this area, but probably immigrants from Europe or Africa for that matter, because again, people in this country were pretty much eating a lot of corn at that time. And again, you know, from the number of graves, because, and again, if you look at, you know, these cemeteries would have been bigger if you take away the lusher building that goes in there. But again, it's a cemetery that's being maintained, and there's care and given to these graves. So they're not just being thrown in, you know, these, and the use of stone to make the graves, again, is showing a lot of energy and a lot of interest. And the lack of graves cutting into these graves indicates that they're marked in some way. People know who's buried where. And again, we talked about the nutritional stress. And again, the high infant mortality rate is not unusual. It's what you would expect to see in this kind of a population. And we would probably not have gotten as many infant burials that we could analyze if it wasn't for the use of all that limestone and that preservation. A lot of other sites you go to, you may not even pick up any of the remains. So just again to summarize some of the more important facts. Again, enslaved and freed African Americans, European Americans, integration, socioeconomic status, not ethnicity, determines where you're placed in the graves. And again, even though we found lots of graves, even though I probably should have said this, when they were stripping, sometimes they had to go 2 or 3 passes, because they hit one pass and we'd hit a grave, and then I'd say, come back, let's make sure there's no grave, and they hit another, because there were so many stacked, you know, once we hit one, we had to stop and excavate that. So they were, but again, we never did find an instance of one grave cutting into another. And again, by 1816, it's fallen into disrepair, and Lusher constructs the brewery there, and that's the start. You get the poorhouse in 1875, which is placed over the western edge of the cemetery. By 1850s, again, there's no evidence to show you that there's any earth there or anybody buried there. And again, in 2002, the cemetery is rediscovered during construction. So we go out there, we do our work, we document it, and then all the graves were reinterred up at Fort Hill. And so this is basically, and has the marker there. And so again, I just want, I want to just put a shout out here to all the people that assisted us, because there were a lot of people that came out. There were people on our crew, but other archaeologists that volunteered just to come out and help us excavate the graves in the cemetery. So if you want to learn more about the cemetery, you can go to discover.ky.gov, which is Discover Kentucky Archaeology. You can also learn more about. Right now we have 115 sites throughout the state posted on that, and we're working on some additional ones. But it's a great place to go to learn about Kentucky archaeology and sites. And you can also download a digital copy of the booklet there. We did bring some hard copies of the booklets, so if you haven't picked one up yet, be sure to pick one up. And we have Archaeology Month posters, and there should be some Kentucky Before Boone posters. And then if you do go to, there's a link to a video, Historic Archaeology Beneath Kentucky's Fields and Streams, and there's about 15 minutes of that video is devoted to the old Frankfort Cemetery. So with that, I'll just open up any questions you all may have, and if anybody wants to fact check me on the booklet. Yeah.
Where did you move the graves to that you dug up? What cemetery did you?
Oh, they're up at Fort Hill.
Fort Hill?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to bring the mic around so
Okay.
everyone on TV can hear your questions.
Now that's organization.
So my brain is going, how in the heck did we not know about this cemetery? So was there not any gravestones, or did the Lusher distillery just say, don't tell anybody, let's just build over it? Or where was all the people in this community? Didn't they talk about it or write about it? I'm just really lost.
Yeah, well, let's say we were shocked at when we saw that Lusher's foundations cut through some of the barrels. So they knew when they put that in there that there was a cemetery there. I think when they put the poorhouse in, I think they knew. Now, later on, I just don't think they knew, because people the headstones get knocked over. A lot of their headstones may have been wooden. And so in time, cemeteries get lost. So it's like the one that we did at the horse park. Again, there was no indication. It was just a field there. And then they started construction, and then here's the cemetery. So in a lot of areas, they just, through time, that history and link to it, the cemetery is lost. It's the only way I can explain it.
I'll make a comment before I ask you a question. If you've been to Cincinnati, Music Hall, across the street is Washington Park. When they went and built the underground parking garage there 20-some-odd years ago, they found it was a cemetery they were digging in. Downtown Cincinnati, I forgot. Back in 2014, I was working up at Fort Hill. Two gentlemen from the Canadian Ministry of Defense came here. They were looking for the graveside of sailing master, can't remember his last name, who was captured with a bunch of British Canadian officers at the Battle of Lake Erie, brought to Frankfort as prisoners of war. And he died here. They had a gravestone and they were looking for the cemetery. They almost put it up at Fort Hill, but decided it wasn't at Fort Hill. Did they talk to you? Okay. It was a weird thing, them showing up and looking for this gravesite. And
They may have, or I may have heard about that. I just don't recall. Now, we did take autopsy samples from each of these graves. So if somebody were to come along and say, hey, I have a relative up there, I want to test some of the samples. And all the graves, they're put in individual boxes. So we could go back and locate a grave. They have a tag with them. But we did take autopsy samples. That's something we routinely do, so we have a record of that.
Okay.
Just how long was the active excavation? How long were you guys working on site there?
We were there 3 months. They were in a hurry to get us out of there.
David, did the age profiles and race profiles of the skeletons you were finding match the census data from that time period, did you see any evidence of epidemics coming through?
No. Well, I had the mortality rates for the 1850s, and so you can see it's pretty much the same. No, there wasn't anything like, where you had an epidemic and you had mass graves. Like when we did the Eastern State Hospital Cemetery, we actually have mass graves there where it looks like they had some sort, either they were holding bodies in the wintertime and waiting to bury in the spring, or they had a lot of people dying at once. So we had one mass grave that had 11 coffins in it.
Okay, I'm bringing it around.
Okay, so I have a question. When they were reinterred, were their personal effects and even maybe part of the accessories with their coffins, were those also reinterred with those bodies?
No.
Okay.
I do not believe. I'm pretty sure we curated those.
Okay. And the other question I had too, were there any records of who the people were? I mean, maybe from family Bibles, or like the other person mentioned the census. Were, other than the two individuals that you were able to identify, were there any other markers or anything that would have identified who the people were?
No, all the markers have been removed, and you also have to remember we're on an active construction site, so we're using a backhoe to clear, and they'd already cleared. So again, there could have been a headstone up top that we missed coming down on it, but basically, if they were wood and stone, if they're wood, or just a lot of graves at that time are just a single marker stone, and then they get knocked over. So I've gone to a lot of rural cemeteries these days, and you go out there, there's very few markers standing, and you have to dig around, and you find where ones have fallen over. But a lot of stones back then, they weren't formal stones. They were just, here's a stone marking the head, and here's a stone marking the foot.
Okay, Julia, did you have another?
So when you say mixed race that you found, was that African American and European mixed, or was there any Native American mixed in it?
We did not see any idea of Native American descent, no. And that did not show up in any of the DNA also.
So what way did they organize the burial when they reburied them in Fort Hill? Like, what organization did you use for that?
We used our numbering system. So we numbered each burial. And so they're organized by those numbers. And I say there's a tag with each one. So if somebody, recognized something about somebody, like say from those ones that we were able to reconstruct what the people looked like, they could track and find that. But they also would have the autopsy sample, so they could do the DNA and see how it matched to their DNA.
Once again, a comment. Roughly 50 years ago, when they were building the Washington, D.C. subway system, they hit an African-American cemetery. The gravestones were all taken down, dumped in the Potomac River, and the station built on top of it. Yeah, other people are nodding. They saw the PBS special on it. So it's nothing unusual to ignore the fact that it was a cemetery there, depending upon who you were.
Well, I think it also depends on how connected you are to the person. I was telling somebody else, I went out to a site construction site where this person said there was a cemetery there, and the developer said there wasn't a cemetery there. And then we flipped the headstone, and once the developer saw he was related to the person that was buried there, it became a cemetery. So there's when you have that disconnect with people, that I think creates the problem. But here, Frank, this was, they just didn't know about it. So I think if the state had known about it, they still would have built where they were building, but I think we would have got in there a lot sooner and been able to do it a lot more, carefully.
All right, I have probably a two-part question. You said something about 30 days. Is that the time that it took for you to?
3 months.
3 months, okay. And then was there a group that met to make the decision to do the reinterment at Fort Hill? Because that seems like a good place for historical purposes to put the reinterment.
Yeah, I forget who we met with. I think somebody came up with the idea, and then we met with the city folks, and everybody agreed that, since that was as close as we could get to where they had been initially buried.
I had a question. Did you happen to see any familial connections, like families or people that seem to be related to each other, either small or in a large quantity of people?
No, we did not. But that to be honest, given the size of the population and what we're looking, we did not really have the time to really do that, and that's kind of hard to do. We had hoped to do all DNA in all 240 burials, and then we may have been able to do a little more of that. But our DNA person was so anal compulsive, he only got through 40.
Hi, given the proximity of the cemetery to the old state penitentiary, did you see any connections between the two sites based upon the work that you did?
No. There's nothing we could say that connects the two. That's not to say they didn't, but there's nothing we could see.
Once again, butting in, the person who made the move to get the people up to Fort Hill was Steve Brooks, who at that time was head of the Park Service here. And it was his idea to move them up there. It was close and it was historic.
Yeah, and it was a good idea.
Anyone else have a question or a comment? All right. Well, let's give Dr. Pollack a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here with us.
All right, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Pollack. I just want to give you all a reminder, also, October is Frankfort's birthday month, October 6th, but for that purpose, we have the Executive Director of the Capital City Museum on October 11th giving a lecture, Odd and Unknown, Frankfort's Unexplainable Phenomena and Academic Approaches to Consider, and that's Dr. Eleanor Haskin-Wagner. So please come out to that, and again, the Paul Sawyer lecture is October 30. Thank you all.